It was nearly midnight when Sarah noticed him. The college library was mostly deserted at this hour, silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of a fellow night owl. Finals were around the corner, and she'd stayed late, hunched over her notes, poring over the last few chapters of her psychology textbook. As she stretched her arms to ease the ache in her back, her eyes landed on a student seated 2 tables away. He'd been there for hours. She'd caught glimpses of him earlier, messy dark hair falling over his face, wearing a hoodie despite the library's sticky warmth. But it wasn't his persistence that struck her now. It was the way he sat, frozen, almost like a statue, hunched over a single open notebook, his head angled down in a way that felt wrong. Sarah dismissed it as exhaustion at first, but every time she tried to return to her work, her eyes found their way back to him. He was utterly motionless, locked in that strange position, as if he were a photograph rather than a person. Her curiosity gnawed at her. She glanced around to make sure she was alone, then stood, her steps soft against the carpeted floor as she approached him. She stopped a few feet away, peering over his shoulder, hoping to catch a glimpse of his face. But his head remained down, hidden beneath the hood, his body hunched so low that his shoulders nearly touched the table. The notebook in front of him was filled with pages of scribbled handwriting, jagged letters that seemed more like scratches than words. The ink bled heavily onto the paper, dark and dense, with no structure or sense to it, just repetitive, spiraling symbols and nonsense words. Hi?" she ventured, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. The silence grew thick, oppressive. A chill seeped into her skin as she took a step closer, cautiously reaching out to tap his shoulder. She hesitated, something instinctual urging her to keep her distance, but her curiosity won out, and her fingers brushed the edge of his hoodie. He twitched. Just a small movement, but enough to send a jolt through her body. Slowly he turned his head, and she finally saw his face. It wasn't right. His skin was pale, almost translucent under the flickering lights, stretched taut across his cheekbones, his eyes sunken and hollow. They were wide open, staring at something far beyond the walls of the library, black and unblinking, as if he'd seen something so horrific it had stolen the life right out of him. His mouth was twisted in a grimace, lips cracked and dry, as if he hadn't spoken or breathed in years. You okay?" she managed, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, his lips parted ever so slightly, and a low, guttural whisper escaped, barely audible, but enough to send a chill down her spine. "I stayed too long." The words hung in the air, thick with something she couldn't name. She took a step back, feeling the blood drain from her face, her heart hammering in her chest. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but something rooted her in place. "What? What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound. He looked at her then, really looked at her, his hollow eyes meeting hers, and she saw something dark and endless in them. A void, a hollow echo of something once human. His hand twitched on the table, his fingers curling as though clutching at something invisible. "I stayed too long," he repeated, his voice a rasp, thick with a desperation that clawed at her insides. "They said, 'No one stays here after midnight. No one ever leaves.'" The clock on the wall ticked to 12, and the sound echoed through the silent library, each chime like a hammer to her chest. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows that twisted and writhed in the corners of the room. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and she felt something cold brush against her skin, like icy fingers trailing up her spine. She turned, stumbling back, her eyes fixed on the door, but it was shrouded in darkness, the exit seeming miles away. Panic surged and she bolted, running past the empty desks and shelves, her footsteps echoing in the hollow silence. But as she neared the door, the shadows thickened, a dark shape looming before her, blocking her path. She stopped short, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she saw the figure before her. It was him, the same student, standing there but twisted, his limbs impossibly long, his fingers curling and uncurling like claws. His face was contorted in an expression of rage, his hollow eyes burning with an unnatural light. "You stayed too long," he hissed, his voice a chilling whisper that filled her ears. "Now, you'll never leave." Her scream echoed through the empty library as the shadows closed in around her, swallowing her in darkness. The last thing she saw was his face, inches from hers, his mouth stretched into a twisted smile, his eyes filled with a hunger that knew no end. The next morning, the library opened as usual, the fluorescent lights buzzing to life, casting their sterile glow over the empty tables and shelves. And in the back corner, a student sat hunched over a notebook, scribbling endlessly, his face hidden beneath a hood, his hands stained with dark ink. No one noticed him. And by midnight, the library would be empty again, except for the whispers that filled the air, a faint, chilling echo of those who had stayed too long. The cabin stood alone, miles from the nearest town, nestled in a dense forest that seemed to swallow any light. The Taylor family had rented it for a quiet getaway from the noise of the city, hoping for some time to relax and reconnect. It was supposed to be a simple, rustic cabin, perfect for unwinding. But when they arrived, the place had an odd, stifling silence about it, and the air felt colder than it should have. After dinner, as they were unpacking, 8-year-old Ellie found a folded piece of paper under her bed. "Mommy, look!" she called, holding it up to her mother. Emma Taylor took the note, frowning. The paper was old and yellowed, the handwriting spidery and rushed. She unfolded it, the words filling her with an uncomfortable chill. "Tonight, the family will arrive, 3 in total. They will laugh and talk, but when night falls, they will begin to hear sounds outside the windows." Emma tried to laugh it off, but the words gnawed at her. She brushed it aside as a prank by the previous guests, folded it, and slipped it into her pocket, telling herself it was nothing. As the evening wore on, they played a few rounds of cards, lit a fire, and laughed as Ellie beat them both at Uno. But later, when Ellie went to grab a mug from the kitchen cabinet, she found another note. This one was folded neatly, pressed up against the wall inside. "At 9 p.m., a loud scratching will start at the back door. No one will be there when they check. The noise will stop and start again from the front door." The family exchanged uneasy glances. Jack, Emma's husband, tried to laugh it off. "It's just some prankster. Maybe they hid notes for the next family to find," he said, forcing a smile. They all tried to ignore the notes and settled back into their game. But as 9 o'clock approached, the cabin grew eerily silent, the kind of silence that prickled the skin and sharpened every sound. And then, just as the note had said, a scratching noise came from the back door, a soft, insistent scraping that cut through the quiet. Jack frowned and headed to the door, trying to keep his steps casual, but his expression betrayed his unease. He opened the door, peering out into the darkness. The light from the cabin cast a dim glow around him, but beyond it, everything was black. There was nothing there. He closed the door, locking it tight. The scratching stopped. For a moment, there was peace again. But then the sound started again. At the front door this time, louder, more deliberate, almost as if someone were dragging their nails across the wood. Emma hugged Ellie close, trying to reassure her. "It's just the wind," she whispered, though her own voice trembled. Jack checked the front door, but again, nothing. The scratching stopped, leaving them all on edge. They tried to go back to their game, but the mood had soured, the cheerful warmth replaced by a thick sense of unease. Just as they were about to call it a night, Ellie found another note tucked under a couch cushion. By 10:30 p.m., the family will try to sleep, but they won't. The lights will flicker and shadows will move. The father will think he sees something in the window, but he will not dare to look again. Ellie looked up at her parents, her wide eyes mirroring their own fear. Jack took the note, his face hardening. "That's enough," he said. "We're leaving. Let's pack up." They hurried to gather their things, tossing clothes into bags, collecting their belongings as fast as they could. But just as Jack went to grab the car keys, the lights flickered, plunging the cabin into darkness before flickering back on again. Shadows seemed to dance along the walls, stretching and warping as though they were alive. Emma clutched Ellie close, her pulse racing. Jack stood by the window, and for a moment his gaze drifted outside. There, beyond the glass, something seemed to move, a dark shape, almost like a figure, watching them. But when he blinked, it was gone. He closed the curtains quickly, his hands shaking. "Everyone stay together," he said, his voice barely steady. As they waited in tense silence, Ellie whimpered, clutching another crumpled piece of paper. She'd found it in the corner by the bookshelf. "They'll try to leave, but the car won't start. And then they'll hear footsteps in the attic, soft at first, then louder, as something begins to descend the stairs." Jack's heart pounded as he pocketed the note. "We'll try anyway," he said, grabbing Emma's hand and guiding her and Ellie toward the door. They ran out to the car, practically tumbling inside. Jack jammed the keys into the ignition, but when he turned them, the engine only sputtered, refusing to start. They sat there, breathless, trapped in the car, their breath fogging up the windows as the silence thickened around them. And then they heard it, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. Footsteps. They seemed to be coming from the attic of the cabin, slow and deliberate, each step echoing in the night air, growing louder as they moved downward. Emma squeezed Ellie's hand, her own knuckles white. The footsteps reached the ground floor, and for a moment there was silence. Then, from the darkness of the cabin, a figure stepped into view, visible only in the faint glow from the car's headlights. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face pale and empty, his eyes fixed on the car. In his hands, he held a piece of paper. Slowly, he unfolded it, his gaze never leaving them as he raised the paper to his lips. And then he began to read, his voice a hollow whisper that echoed through the stillness. "At dawn, they will be found. But no one will know what they saw that night. No one will understand the fear they felt, the horrors they faced, the whispers that filled their minds, until it was too late." The family huddled together in the car, trapped, as the man's whisper carried through the night, his empty eyes fixed on them, sealing their fate as the final note slipped from his fingers and drifted to the ground. It was past midnight when Daniel stumbled upon the old camera. He'd been cleaning out his attic, sorting through dust-coated boxes and forgotten belongings from past tenants. The camera was vintage, heavy in his hands, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Its metal casing was worn, and there was a faint smell of decay on it, as though time itself had seeped into its frame. Curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to see if there was still film inside. To his surprise, there was. Feeling a thrill of excitement, he decided to develop the photos. His garage had an old, makeshift darkroom setup, inherited from the previous homeowner. It would take time, but he wanted to know what secrets the camera held. When he saw the first photo, a chill swept over him. It was his own bedroom, captured in eerie black and white. The angle was strange, as if someone had been standing at the foot of his bed. And there, lying on his side, clearly asleep, was himself. Daniel blinked, telling himself it was just a trick of the mind. Maybe someone had taken it as a prank, or perhaps he'd forgotten using the camera himself. But as he developed more photos, each one made his skin crawl. In the second photo, he was still asleep in bed. But this time, a shadowy figure stood in the doorway of his room. It was tall, almost stretching to the ceiling, with a distorted outline, as if someone had smudged the figure into reality. The features were blurred, yet its face seemed turned toward him, watching him sleep. He felt a shiver run down his spine. Who could have taken these? How did they even get the camera into his attic? Trying to calm his nerves, he continued developing the photos, his hands shaking slightly. The next few photos showed the shadowy figure creeping closer to his bed, moving from the doorway to the edge of his room, each picture showing it standing just a bit nearer than before. In one particularly unsettling image, the figure was now standing directly beside him, looking down with an intensity that felt palpable, even through the grainy black and white image. Its outline was jagged, the features almost inhuman, but what scared him most was the shadow's hand. It was extended, hovering inches above his face. He stepped back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He wanted to throw the camera out, smash the film, burn it, but he couldn't stop. There was one last photo left to develop, and some part of him needed to see it through. In the final photo, the figure was gone. Instead, the picture was a close-up, taken inches from his face. His sleeping expression looked peaceful, oblivious. But what caught his eye were the faint markings around his neck, dark shadows that seemed like fingers pressing into his skin. Daniel dropped the photo, his heart pounding wildly. His mind raced, wondering who had taken these, or if he'd somehow captured a piece of something otherworldly. That's when he felt it, a cold breath against his neck, the faint weight of a hand pressing into his shoulder. He turned, but no one was there. The darkroom was silent. But when he glanced at the developed photos on the table, he saw that final image again, staring back at him. Except now, he wasn't alone in the photo. In the reflection of his window, the shadowy figure hovered just behind him, waiting, as if it had been with him all along.